So fantastic. Okay. So, welcome to my presentation. Today I'm presenting my very last research finding on mapping democratic innovation. This research is part of my Swiss National Science Foundation postdoctoral research plan on comparatively analyzed democratic innovation around the world. So as such, the core of this project is Participedia, because Participedia is the largest data set on democratic innovation available. So ultimately, this research allows to empirically categorize real-world cases of democratic innovation. Sorry, my voice is a bit. So why is it important to map democratic innovation? Well, there are several reasons why we should map and create topology of political and social items. Here I will just mention a few of them by considering a broader perspective to a specific perspective for this research. So first, from a broad perspective, mapping is important exercise to create analytical frameworks for comparative analytical targets. So obviously, we know comparative analysis play a cardinal role in political and social science. So given it is a tool of cross-case validation and allow to externally validate between case finding. So if we wish to cross-validate our research finding, it is important to individuate an analytical framework that allow for cross-case comparison. In a more specific terms, this research allow evaluating democratic innovation from an empirical perspective. So in this respect, we already have some study that evaluates democratic innovation considering, I would say, more theoretical sophistication, but none of the existing study actually empirically evaluates real-world democratic innovation. And so little is known about how democratic innovation can be de facto classified and framed. Finally, this research provides a picture of the status of democratic innovation around the world with a close look on Participedia data set. So how democratic innovation has been considered by the literature up to now. So up to now, we find two specific approaches in classifying democratic innovation. So a good overview of this can be found in Elstab and Escobar book chapter inserted in the handbook of democratic innovation and governance. So the first way to typologize democratic innovation is a format-centered approach, which considers democratic innovation as container of attributes, process and outcome. Here, for example, Smith characterized format of popular assemblies, mini-publics, participatory budgeting, direct legislation, e-democracy, or Elstab and Escobar themselves distinguish the format of mini-public, participatory budgeting, referendum, or collaborative governance. The second way to categorize democratic innovation is a process-centered approach, which focuses on process. Processes are transversal to democratic innovation. Here, for example, Brigitte Geisel specify the deliberative procedure, the direct procedure, and the cooperative governance procedure. So here I would like to give a bit of critical overview of this way to categorize. So, sorry, mix up. What is it? Yeah, sorry. First, the format-centered topology. So I would like to emphasize two limitations of the format-centered topology. First, part of this limitation has been also emphasized by Elstab and Escobar anyway. But first, this approach tends to produce rigid typology. This because of the nature of the format, which is an enclosed container. So as such, whatever does not match the definitional characteristic of a format is outside the format. On the other hand, the risk is to define a too vague topology that are too broad and do not have a proper identity. The risk here is to create a topology that are not very informative from an analytical perspective. So as depicted by this graph, the relationship between number of cases and number of attributes in format-centered topologies is in tension. So format with high number of attributes are too rigid and risk to omit cases, so they are too specific. In other words, the more attribute we have to define a topology, the less cases we will have within this such category. While format with low number of definition attributes are too broad, they engulf several formats, but are not very useful from an analytical perspective. It is difficult to identify through a vague topology what is central or peripheral to a topology. So what about the process-centered topology? So probably this approach is the best way to go, but unfortunately, sorry, just otherwise I cannot see. But unfortunately, as it has been proposed by Geisel, it's also suffer of some limitation due to the use of, I would say, a conceptual and an explanatory dimension to define processes. So to be more specific, Geisel distinguished direct, deliberative, and cooperative procedures. However, on the one hand, while deliberative and direct procedure refer to, I would say, an ontic level of the process, considering how democratic innovation, decision, and participation works. On the other hand, cooperative procedure focus on more on epistemic targets of democratic innovation. So the level of empowerment, the legitimacy, or the effectiveness of the procedure. So in this respect, nothing is told on how cooperative governance, participation, and decision-making process works. So we do not have many information on what cooperative governance consists from an ontic perspective. In this respect, we can have feature in cooperative governance that overlaps with direct or deliberative procedure. So essentially, also in this case, we have a conceptual stretching because explanatory dimension is mainly attentive to, I would say, an epistemic level of democracy, of democratic innovation without defining the core ontic characteristics. So to be clear, a concrete example can be, for example, the citizen initiative review, which can be considered as deliberative procedure when we look at the conceptual dimension related to the selection of participants and their interaction. However, when we look at the citizen initiative review from an explanatory perspective, it is related to a direct democratic procedure, given its function is to inform the population on referendum content. So if we adopt Geisel perspective, citizen initiative review can be either considered deliberative procedure or example of cooperative governance when we look at it from the perspective of impact and effectiveness. So finally, a second limitation of Geisel proposition is that is too narrow. So indeed, if the ontic level, if we focus only on the ontic level that she proposed, so deliberative and direct democratic procedure, we will omit a series of cases which procedure are neither deliberative or direct. So we won't be able to classify, for example, cases like microfinance, citizen journalism, occupation, or things like this, or parking. So finally, Elstab and Escobar in their book chapter propose a family resemblance format. I actually wrote pseudo, but I will explain why. So family resemblance is a strategy to classify object considering similarity function. So family resemblance categorization is based on Wittgenstein idea. The concept can be defined through, I would say, a membership function of similarity, and not to the idea that a concept is composed by attributes. So while this approach is interesting, it is hardly workable on format center setting as proposed by Elstab and Escobar. For similar reason listed before, so Elstab and Escobar still consider format as container of attribute. So the membership function of a case to a format is not defined by its similarity to another case, but the presence or absence of specific attributes. So more specifically, Elstab and Escobar distinguish format considering a crisscross network of attributes between quasi-contingent elements as mode of participation, decision-making process, and contextual element as a policy area. So I would say they, they do not approach a format in terms of similarity function as family resemblance suggests, but as an enclosed container of quasi-contingent contextual elements. So mixing up quasi-contingent contextual elements also creates a conceptual stretching by the end of the day, because the ontic epistemic level of democratic innovation are mixed up. So in this respect, for example, Elstab and Escobar classify participatory budgeting as a standalone category by considering unnecessary attributes of this typology, the specific contextual element of public spending with other quasi-contingent element of participation, selection mode, and decision output. In fact, as we will see in this analysis, participatory budgeting is only a point of a cluster that engulfs other type of similar democratic innovation and not a super category as implied by Elstab and Escobar. So how to resolve this analytical issue of concept stretching that appear in in all the existing approach in classifying democratic innovation. Here I'm proposing, I would say, a prototypical approach, considering Elena Roche's idea of prototype theory and George Lakoff's idea of radial categorization. So both approaches are also rooted in Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblance. So as argued in this approach, as argued here, this approach avoids the risk of conceptual stretching. This is because membership of cases is defined by the distance to a prototype, to a central cases. And also we can distinguish what is prototype and peripheral cases. So to help me in explaining what prototypical approach is, I asked my 7-year-old son, Francis, so to help me. So what I asked him, a bit mimicking the example reported in the literature on prototype theory, is to draw in the center of a paper the most, I don't know, say birdy animals, and the less bird in the other circles. I don't know, bird-like. It doesn't exist, bird. Birdish. So at the center, you draw a bird that can be a robin or a sparrow. He actually doesn't know what it is, but this is the most prototypical idea of my son, and probably is the most prototypical idea of bird in general, I guess. Is it prototypical or archetypical? Prototypical. Yeah, okay. Well, because it's the best observable example. So it's not an abstract. So in contrast, in the other circle, we find a duck, a kiwi, and a pterodactyl. I thought it was a dragon, but it's a pterodactyl. So prototypical characterization is this. The membership of an object is related to its distance defined in terms of similarity to a center or prototypical idea. So the more the object is distance from the idea, the less central and representative of the category will be. So as in the bird example, duck mainly swim, can still fly, but is more birdy than a kiwi, which cannot fly, has tiny wings. And finally, a pterodactyl looks like a bird because it can fly, has wings, but the shape of the face, of the beak, doesn't have feathers or whatever. It's not a bird. But pterodactyls are peripheral to the idea of bird, but also they are peripheral to the idea of dinosaurs, as they have wings and they fly, so unlike prototypical dinosaurs, which probably is a T-Rex or something like this. I have to ask my son. So how to analyze the data, so Participedia, considering this prototypical approach. So I'm approaching the issue by considering a dimensional reduction analytical strategy. So, and observe how different cases are related to each other through a similarity function by considering, I would say, a cluster analysis on principal components. So I'm not going into, I guess, the technicality of the analysis. However, this analysis has at least two important advantages. One is related to Participedia dataset, which is made by categorical linguistic variables. So this analysis allows me to handle categorical and linguistic variable in a systemic way. So I do not have to code the variable, but I can use the data set as it is. So I don't have to transform the linguistic variable into number, but I can use the words. The second advantage is that this approach will produce a bidimensional spatial map, kind of similar to the bird map I showed before, but on democratic innovation. So see how democratic innovation are distributed on grouped. So the analysis has been done on Participedia, so the data set. Participedia data is structured considering cases, methods, organization, and collection. So my focus are methods, which refer to the type of democratic innovation. Methods are regroup cases. So once you map methods, you can look at the cases as well. I didn't actually, but I will. So when we navigate in Participedia dataset, we can extract several variables. We have a variable that's allowed to identify how democratic innovation works and who participates, who, as for example, the recruitment strategy or the number of participants, and how we have, for example, the interaction type of the decision-making process. We have other variables that refer the point to this question. I'm not going to explain which one. Anyway, from all the variables provided by the data set, I decided to include all the variables that point to this conceptual or more ontic dimension of democratic innovation, so how and who, excludes all the variable that can be source of conceptual stretching, so as contextual feature, such, I don't know, country, for example, or explanatory dimension as political target or a policy area, or policy application. So here we are at the analysis. So the analysis produces 4 clusters. So the 4 clusters are pointing to 2 big macro clusters. So we have 2 big macro clusters. So the first big macro cluster refer to, I would say, a more passive participatory mode of participation, and contain that pink and the green cluster, so cluster 1 and cluster 2. The second big macro cluster, this one, refer to a more, I would say, tool-centric way of participation. It contains this turquoise and purple cluster 4.
Sorry, what centric?
Tool-centric.
Tool-centric, okay.
I'm going to the tile, be better now, but yeah. So the pink cluster, this one, doesn't. So is I would say I label this cluster 1 as mass participatory democratic innovation. So between these clusters, it is important the number of participants, the more the best. If we have, for example, referendum, protest, or crowdfunding, so all the democratic innovation in which the number allowed to rise the impact of the format or its democratic legitimation. So here the interaction between participants is minimal and definitely not discourse author-centric, while the selection criteria is mainly voluntary based. Cluster 2, the green cluster, were labeled as micro collaborative participatory democratic innovation. Here we find, for example, citizen journalism or other community activities. In this cluster, the underlying feature is the absence of a decision-making procedure. Not always, but that's what they found. And a relatively small number of participants. Then we have cluster 3. Here we will say, well, label as a more conventional deliberative democratic innovation. Well, here we find the discourse-centric mode of participation. So the number of participants tend to be small, and the selection criteria is mainly based on random stratified selection. And then we have the purple class, which I label as, I say, less conventional deliberative democratic innovation. Here, I would say, we find a form of democratic innovation that are tool-centric, but do not necessarily imply reason-giving prerequisite of participation. So selection can be voluntary or by appointment, not random, and the number can be large or small. So,
sorry, Francesco, I think maybe I'm colorblind, but the pink is the far left.
Yeah, the one
over there.
Yeah, well, it's not important. I mean, the dimension, but I mean, that's class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's not pink. It's, I don't know this.
Sort of orange, but anyway.
Sorry for Pierre, because
I'm looking at going. Yeah.
So that's, you see all gray, I guess. But so in relation to the prototypical approach, when we organize the cluster between a bidimensional map, we can observe central and prototypical cases, as in the heuristic example of Bird mentioned before. So central cases here are the one in which we don't have overlapping area. So here, and here. So for example, in cluster 1, so this one, the red one, we have, for example, the referendum, but also a form of protest as occupation, a form of collective participation as crowdsourcing, as crowdfunding, microfinance. In cluster 2, where is this one? We have an example of, I would say, citizen or student journalism or various community service activity. In cluster 3, which is this one, we have various forms of deliberative mini-public, a citizen assembly, citizen initiative review, but also the deliberative pooling. Finally, in cluster, the purple one, in cluster 4, we have, well, we have the central cases here, for example, is a participatory budgeting. But there is other cases. Actually, I don't remember which one they are. But there is other form that's not participatory budgeting, but they are central to these cases. So actually, I should do this. So we can also distinguish peripheral cases. So the peripheral cases in this case, they are in the center of the graph, so in all the overlapping area. So we find that, for example, what Participedia defined as traditional governance. Well, obviously, I would say this form of participation deeply vary across contexts. However, in this case, it overlaps with a conventional deliberative cluster, mass participatory cluster, and collaborative participatory cluster. So it overlap with 3 different clusters. So this is because this membership is actually, well, from this analysis, is ambiguous or hybrid. So it's not centric of neither of the cluster, but is a discourse-centric or thought-centric way of communicating, plus we have a big part of the community is usually involved, so it's kind of a mass participatory, but given the community are usually relatively small, the group size, so I would say is kind of more a micro collaborative cluster. So it's kind of a hybrid. So we have other peripheral methods that can be, or for example, study circles. Here we have a discourse-centric mode of participation. So, but the selection criteria is voluntary and based on, there is not a decision-making process. So it's kind of hybrid as well. So there are several examples in this respect. What is important is that peripheral cases tend to have a membership status in one specific cluster, but can be considered for various reasons part of a different cluster. So in conclusion or in discussion, I would like to summarize some findings of this mapping exercise. So first, we observed that the presence of the macro cluster of participatory and deliberative cluster. So between these 2 macro clusters, we have 2 subclusters which define democratic innovation divided by 4 dimensions. So while the 2 macro clusters refer to different ways on how participants interact, respectively tendentially passive and tendentially active, between a macro dimension of participatory group, important feature that distinguishes the 2 clusters is how many participants are involved, while between the other deliberative macro cluster, the distinguish, say, is who participates. So here the selection mode is important. Finally, between this proposed framework format, so the format like referendum or participatory budgeting become a simple point of a universe of a democratic innovation. So here again, I can critically address previous strategies to typologize democratic innovation, but what I would like to stress is that my proposition goes, I would say, try to go beyond the format and process, or go beyond the format center and process center idea of democratic innovation. So it's more I say a trans-format classification, in which formats are not container but elements themselves of what democratic innovation is, and processes are still transversal to democratic innovation, but they define the dimension that according to which the formats are located. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.